Welcome everyone to Ancient Egypt's Coldest Cases. My name is Dr. Katie East. I'm a forensic anthropologist and science communicator, and today we're examining some of the world's oldest suspicious deaths. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself. As I mentioned, my name is Dr. Katie East. I am a forensic anthropologist. I've worked as a forensic anthropologist for about 6 years now in a federal laboratory. And prior to that, I received my PhD in anthropology. And my research at that time focused on biochemical analyses of stress hormones in remains from ancient Egypt, historic United States, and today. So I'm doing something a little bit different now, but this talk is an attempt to sort of go back to some of my roots with my study of human remains in ancient Egypt. And when I'm not working as a forensic anthropologist, I like to think of myself as a science communicator. And what that means to me is that I enjoy taking the time to talk to people about the stuff that I love, the things that I've learned, the research that I've done. And I do this for a few reasons. The first is because I love it. I really enjoy it. It's a chance to get out of the laboratory and talk to living people. But the second reason is that I think more scientists have a responsibility to do this. A lot of our research is taxpayer funded. I want to make sure that taxpayers get to experience the fruits of that labor. The second is that everyone gets to be curious. Everyone should have the right to explore and engage with some of this really interesting science. And I want to help make some of that more accessible to more people. And lastly is that right now there's a lot of distrust around science and scientists. And I think a lot of that stems from poor communication. So if I can help mend some of those bridges and show that scientists are engaging and empathetic and are using science to answer real questions or try to solve human problems, I want to be part of that. So without further ado, I just want to provide a quick content warning moving forward. We will be having discussion and showing pictures of human remains. Nothing's too gruesome or gory, and everything has been published previously, but I do want to give you that warning. So if that's not something you're interested in today, now would be a good time to leave. And so as we move forward, I want you to think about a few questions and sort of take a second, think about these questions, think about what you already know, and then we will return to these at the end and hopefully you'll have some pretty solid answers for them. But throughout, I want you to think about, can a forensic anthropologist do the following? So can a forensic anthropologist study ancient human remains? Can a forensic anthropologist determine timing of injury? And can an anthropologist determine cause of death? So I'm not going to give you the answers now. Take a second, think about it, keep the answers in the back of your mind, and we'll return to this at the end and see how you do. So if you're already confused and you don't know what forensic anthropology is, now's the time for me to explain that. Forensic anthropology is essentially the study of human remains in a medical or legal context. And so that means applying the methods and procedures from biological anthropology or bioarchaeology in the study of skeletons and human remains and the recovery of those remains, and applying it to questions of medical or legal significance. So things like identification or an investigation, things like that. And so given that definition, any study of ancient human remains doesn't really fall into the definition of forensic anthropology because we're not trying to identify anyone, we're not trying to bring anyone to court or carry out an investigation. This is the small distinction between anthropology more broadly and forensics in this medical legal context. That being said, forensic anthropologists have some unique experiences compared to anthropologists or bioarchaeologists. And these are particularly in the area of trauma analysis and the analysis of something called taphonomy. So trauma analysis, you probably all sort of know what this is. It's injury specifically to bone in the case of forensic anthropology. And taphonomy is the study of what happens to remains after death. And so forensic anthropologists have a lot of experience in these two facets sort of investigation, a little bit more than bioarchaeologists might. And that's simply because of what our research questions are, the type of remains or materials we're working with, and how those remains came to be. As you might imagine, bioarchaeologists are much more interested in population level questions, questions about health or activity, how people lived in the past. Forensic anthropologists are interested in how someone died. And so we often see more things related to trauma and also then what happened to the body after death as it relates to criminal cases. So we have a lot more experience in these two things, and that helps us really dig into understanding a bit more about the circumstances around an individual's death. And this is, again, not often of interest, I shouldn't say of interest to bioarchaeologists, often beyond the abilities of bioarchaeologists to assess because of the nature of their questions and the material they're looking at. Notice I said here, though, circumstances around death and not cause of death. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in just a few slides. But the main reason is essentially there are a lot of ways that someone can die that don't affect your skeleton. And your skeleton reflects injuries in a very specific way. So in a legal setting, legally identifying the cause of death is beyond the scope of the forensic anthropologist. That falls to the medical examiner. So in that legal setting, the forensic anthropologist provides all the information they can about the circumstances around death, and the medical examiner makes that final assertion. We'll be fudging that line a little bit today to look a little bit if we can examine manner of death, but that is an important distinction to make. And I'll explain again a little bit why in a second. So I'm going to give you the fastest rundown on how forensic anthropologists assess trauma that anyone has ever given. But don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this. It's just to give you kind of an awareness of some of the things we'll be talking about in a second. So when we're assessing trauma in the skeleton, we're looking at three main things. We're looking at the timing of the injury, the force that resulted in the injury, and the direction of the injury. So when I say force, I mean sharp force, blunt force, or projectile trauma. These are pretty self-explanatory, especially if you've watched CSI or Bones or anything like that. One thing I do always like to point out, though, in this case, is blunt force doesn't always mean hit with an implement. It can be something like a fall or motor vehicle crash. All of those things also count as blunt force because of the sort of distributed area of that force on an individual. So that's the first thing we look at. The second thing we look at is timing. So we have three general time periods we think about when we think about injuries to the skeleton. We have antemortem, just before death, perimortem, which is around death, and postmortem, which is after death. Now, despite what you might have seen on television, this perimortem little area here is actually a bit more complicated than it looks. When you watch shows like Law and Order and CSI, and the medical examiner is talking, they sometimes can pretty much identify exactly what happened at the moment of death, because they're looking at things like soft tissue, right? So they can look at bruising or lack of bruising. They can look at bleeding or lack of bleeding. Bones don't bruise or bleed. So we have to look at other factors to try to figure out when an injury occurred. And the main thing that we're looking at is, did the bone act like it was alive? And did it have time to show evidence of healing? And if those two things, if they didn't have evidence of healing, but acted like it was alive, then it's the perimortem period. And what I mean by that is your bone is made up of mineral and organic material. And as long as those proportions stay the same, your bone is going to act just like it would if your body was alive. So sometimes that's a couple hours after death. Sometimes if it's a waterlogged environment, it can be weeks to months after death. So this perimortem period can actually look a lot more like this. I should also say that signs of healing, I can talk a little bit about this later, but is essentially sort of rounding of the edges of a fracture as the bone starts to fill in. That can take days, weeks to show up on an X-ray, never mind to be visible with the naked eye. So again, that sort of perimortem period is broadened on either end. So we have to be careful when we talk about timing and cause of death, because we can't actually pinpoint the moment of death, despite all of our best efforts. And the last thing we look at is direction. And so in this example here, this is obviously very clear. We have an entry and an exit wound in the case of a projectile trauma. It's not always that clear, but it is one of the primary things we look at. Which direction was somebody potentially hit with? Was it front to back? Was it from an upper direction or a lower direction? And we can use all of this information again to look at circumstances around death. And it's pretty actually, there's a very small number of characteristics we look at to examine these three factors. We look at the outline of the fracture. So what is the general shape? Is it more curved? That's more of a perimortem fracture. Is it more stepped or jagged or shows 90-degree angles? Probably more postmortem, so something that happened after death. How big is it? That can tell us, if somebody was hit with an implement or if the person hit something. Location, that can tell us a lot about lethality. If the injury is in a situation that has heavy blood flow, or we know has problems with healing or things like that, that can provide us with information. And then we actually look at what's called the margins of the fracture. So sometimes we do this microscopically, sometimes we do it with the naked eye, and we actually look at where the fracture comes together. We look at the inside there, and we look at whether it's smooth, that's perimortem. If it's jagged or frayed, that's postmortem. We look at the color. Is it the same as the surrounding bone or different? And we'll even sometimes look at what the angle looks like. If there's beveling, it might be more indicative of blunt force or projectile trauma, depending on where it is. So that's it. Now you guys are all experts at trauma analysis. That's what I did, all however many years of schooling for, but you guys got it in 2 minutes. So the question really does become, how do we put together all these pieces to try to determine if we have a homicide? And this has a lot of aspects to it, of course, but essentially, is this a injury that somebody could have inflicted themselves or could have been inflicted accidentally, or must it have been inflicted by a third party? Can we look at intentionality? And you might be thinking, this is crazy. It's not worth doing. How could we possibly look at intentionality in the past? But there are actually some really great examples of researchers having done this in far older cases than ancient Egypt. This is actually a Neanderthal cranium from about 43,000 years ago. And you can see that there's a defect to the sort of forehead area. And this is an example of blunt force trauma. And it's an example of perimortem trauma. And we can tell that because of the beveling and because of the radiating fracture. So very clear example here of perimortem blunt force trauma. But you can also tell that it's kind of a narrow sort of circular area. It's not a diffuse area, and it's above sort of the brow ridge. And forensic anthropologists have done a lot of research to figure out, if you fall down, where are you most likely to hit your head? And there's actually an imaginary line, they call it the hat brim line, where if you have an injury above that, it's very unlikely you did that yourself from falling down. So this is a really great example of very likely an injury inflicted by another individual. So this, in many cases, would be considered an example of interpersonal violence. So they can do it 43,000 years ago. I think we have a shot at looking at it from some ancient Egyptian cases. So that being said, let's change our focus a little bit and get started into our cases. I have 4 cases to show you all today. Hopefully we have time. If I'm running short on time, just tell me to stop and I will. I normally only do 3 cases in this talk, but I know you guys have a lot of good background information, so I figured you'd appreciate the 4th one. But we'll start first with our first case file. It's Gebelline Man. And Gebelline Man is a pre-dynastic mummy, so 3000 plus BC. And this, we don't have any of the, as far as I could find, any of the original excavation photographs from this individual. They were excavated in the early 1900s. But this is one of the earliest displays of this individual at the British Museum. And he was essentially on display since he was excavated in the early 1900s. This is the exhibit today. You can see that very little has changed, and this individual has been on display for essentially over 100 years. Mostly unchanged. You can see a rock has been added for a bit of modesty. But other than that, very little has changed in the way that this individual has been seen by the public. But in 2012, a CT scan was done. And they weren't looking for anything in particular. What they wanted to do was build some 3D models that they could actually put in the exhibit hall so that people could work through them and move around and see what anthropology was all about and how that related to the mummy in front of them. And they found some really interesting things. So they created this 3D sort of model. They did not provide the 3D, I can't turn it around, but I promise it's 3D in the museum. And you can strip away the different layers and you can get down to the skeleton. And you can then look at multiple views of the skeleton. There's quite a few cracks and breaks in the skeleton. You can see it in the leg, the pelvis, some of the ribs here. These are all post-mortem. The original researchers that did the CT scan suggest that, and I 100% agree with that. And that's because they're very straight and they're very geometric. You see a lot of right angles and you don't see a lot of radiating fractures. So this is probably because these remains are so desiccated and so dried out that they're just very fragile. And they've been on display and moved around for over 100 years. So very, very clear examples of post-mortem trauma. That being said, remember I said this individual has been on display for over 100 years. And you can see on the head and the back, there's lots of cracking and flaking off of the skin. Again, this individual is 5,000 years old, to be expected that there's some damage. And there was a very innocuous little crack on the scapula here, so the shoulder blade. And for 100 years, nobody thought anything of it. And they ran these scans and they noticed, oh, underneath that crack is actually what we would call in the biz, a linear defect, straight line that cuts into the bone. And so then they stripped away that layer and it actually goes through I did that backwards. The skin, the muscle is over the bone. And then it goes through the bone. So this is actually sort of a bit of a cutaway image of the scapula and then actually goes through the ribs. And I can just one more image of that. And what this is a pretty clear example is sharp force trauma. And the researchers suggest that, and I totally agree. They suggest that it's probably about a 2-inch blade, very sharp-sided blade that entered the back of this individual and likely permeated through their shoulder blade, their ribs, and then potentially into the lungs as well. And there's absolutely no signs of healing. So even if in the unlikely case of this individual survived, they likely did not survive very long from this injury. So again, we cannot say it's cause of death necessarily, because who knows? He could have ingested poison minutes after being stabbed in the back. Unlikely, unlikely. Occam's razor here. But this is a very, I'm not going to say clear example, but a very nice example of likely interpersonal violence, or potentially, in this case, homicide, because the angle, this is not a self-inflicted wound because it's coming from the back. It is in a potentially lethal area, having impacted the lungs, and it's very unlikely to have been accidental. For someone to sort of fall straight up and down onto a blade of some sort is a very unlikely set of circumstances. So our first case here, probably an example of interpersonal violence. And for all the reasons that I just said, because I forgot to switch to the next slide. So case number 1 is in the books. We will move on to case file number 2, and this is Second Enrata. Second Enrata was the king of Upper Egypt during the late secondary intermediate period. And of course, Lower Egypt at that time was invaded by the Hyksos. And there were tensions, as there are whenever Egypt is invaded by a foreign power. But things really boiled over when the king of the Hyksos sent a letter to Second Enrata and said, "Those hippos that you have in that sacred pool in Thebes, they just make too much noise. I can't sleep." And wow, Second Enrata was very offended. This is in written sources, I'm not making this up. He was very offended, and he decided he was going to initiate a revolt. He was going to revolt against the Hyksos. And in fact, his revolution was successful. And by the time of his son, Ahmose, Egypt was reunified. And we have written historical records to say that the kingdom of Egypt was reunited under Ahmose, that his older brother, so Second Enrata's first son, Kamose, died in battle, but there's no written record as to what exactly happened to Second Enrata. We can't assume necessarily good things, since his son did have to finish his revolution, but there were no written records for a long time. I know this is a terrible grainy photograph, but it's just so cool. This is an image of the discovery of the Deir el-Bahri cache in the 1800s, where they found all of those sort of mummies from the 18th dynasty and essentially second intermediary period. And one of the mummies they found had his original wrappings still on him with his name on them, is how they identified him, and it was Second Enrata. And he immediately started receiving attention for what were to many obvious signs of violence upon his body. We have some updated pictures here, and you can still see what are potentially signs of injuries upon his head. But in 2019, they carried out some advanced CT scanning of his mummy as part of a sort of larger research project. And the images are really great and provide some really interesting detailed information about these injuries and potentially others. So we'll go through them. The first thing they found was that the king's hands were in an atypical position, and they also sort of showed this interesting flexion in the wrist. The researchers suggest this may be because of something that happened around the time of death. I'm a little bit on the fence about that, but it's certainly worth noting. Other things that we find, this is the thorax down to the pelvis of the mummy here. And you can see that there's what we call disarticulation. The bones are sort of mixed up. They're not in their anatomical position. We have a vertebra just sort of hanging out there. Again, suggestive, in the past, people have suggested maybe a hasty mummification. Things got sort of mixed around or moved around. We'll see about that. And this is actually an earlier image of Second Enrata's cranium, and that light gray area you see there is actually his brain. So you all probably know that it was standard procedure to remove the brain during mummification. And not only was the brain not removed here, but it was actually became solidified against the left side of the cranium, indicating that the king was not in fact laying on his back during desiccation of the brain, which is highly unusual. And now we'll talk about those head injuries a little bit more. So we have the first one. We'll start with the one high up on the forehead. And we'll look at these nice new CT images for that. The key things to really take away from this one is this sort of overall rectangular outline, this sort of punched out clean margins, and this very nice sort of, very nice sounds awful, very clear fracture that continues off to the left side. So we would call that a radiating fracture. And it's indicative not only that this injury is likely perimortem, but also that it was high velocity, high force. We have lots of other things going on as well. So we have the injury to the forehead that's just below that, circled here. And you can see there's actually more of sort of a circular outline to this one. And the researchers who did the most recent CT scanning suggest that this could have actually been sharp force trauma, maybe more of a sort of a dagger implement. I don't have the original scan, so I can't really reevaluate that because I'd have to see the margins there. Certainly a possibility that it's sharp force, also a possibility that it was very hard or high velocity blunt force in this area. Because if you have high velocity blunt force, it can actually break things into multiple fractures, and some of those fragments can fall out and be lost. So hard to say for sure in this case, but either way, another injury in addition to the one on the upper forehead. So we're up to at least 2. Then we have this whole complex of injuries around the right eye. So we have the injuries to sort of the brow and the nose, as well as to what we call we call it the zygomatic, but the cheekbone essentially. And it's a fracture through the cheekbone that's also been displaced sort of into the facial area. And then the last one at the facial area is the similar fracture on the left side. So we have, again, continuing from the fracture to the nose, sort of a dislocation almost between what's called the maxilla and the zygomatic. And this is just another view of that same thing. So the researchers that did this most recent CT scans suggest that this could be multiple different events. My initial instinct is to actually say that all the stuff going on in the face is one injury, and it could have been a result of something like a club, some sort of rather diffuse blunt force trauma, just because of the way they communicate so nicely. You kind of have this direct line from one to the other. Not to say they aren't impossible to necessarily exclude multiple instances here, but could be as few as one incident in this scenario. There's a few other things that they found too. There's an injury. You can see there's a little bone spur next to the occipital condyle. Again, the images aren't great to evaluate this, but if this is an example of sharp force trauma, it suggests that there was a very sharp implement, essentially stabbed into sort of under the jaw area. And that would, of course, sever lots of important things in that area to basically hit the underside of the cranium. And then in the most recent paper, they also talk about fractures to the right side of the cranium, but they didn't provide pictures. So I don't know what these look like. If they are perimortem, it suggests a whole separate event than the 2 that happened on the face. So we're talking at least 2 instances of trauma, potentially 2 different weapons. The researchers suggest there could be up to 4 different weapons that are used if you count the one to the bottom of the neck, the one to the forehead, the upper forehead, and the face. But at least I can definitely confirm there's at least 2 separate weapons being used in this case. So what are our hypotheses? Notice I use hypotheses and not theories because I'm a scientist, and hypotheses are testable. That's not how the word theory works. So hypothesis number 1 is one that's been around essentially since this mummy was first discovered. When people first saw those injuries upon his face, they thought assassination. And I just think that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were just looking for assassinations everywhere when it came to mummies. But their arguments were pretty sound for the time. The idea that this injury to the forehead comes from a sort of downward angle. It's up here, right? You're not necessarily going to hit someone in an upward angle and get that. You would have to be coming down. So perhaps the king was laying down. I would also potentially account for lack of defensive wounds in other parts of the body, and could account for why they focused on his face. If you're assassinating someone, maybe you want to really cause that damage to the thing that represents him the most, his face. However, the angle of injury doesn't mean that the king was laying down. It just means he was lower than his attacker. So could be a piece of information, isn't definitive. And then secondly, remember all those things I talked about, like the disarticulation of the thorax and the brain still intact? The researchers make a really good point that this could suggest that mummification had to be delayed for some reason, and that the body had already partially decomposed. And I think that has a lot of merit for what we're seeing sort of in the mummy, the way that it's been mummified. And if that is the case, unlikely that the king was assassinated in the palace, because he would foreseeably be able to be mummified quite quickly if he was assassinated in his own home. So this could suggest he was killed somewhere else, and it took a while for him to get back to be mummified. But don't worry, there's other hypotheses. The second one is another one that has received a lot of attention. It's the idea that he died in battle. He was, of course, the instigator of this revolution. We know his son died in battle. Maybe it's not far off to think that he died in battle. Again, we have all those fractures to the face. We have, again, the decomposition. Maybe he did die in battle somewhere else, and it took him a while to get back to the palace or to the areas to be mummified. But there's a few things that I think don't quite line up with this hypothesis. It's very hard to keep saying hypothesis. I want to say theory, but it's not scientifically correct. There are no other injuries that we can find on his body. I personally have never been in battle, but I would imagine in a battle scenario, it's very unlikely that you are receiving all of your injuries within a, 6-inch, 8-inch, very small area within your body, and that there's no defensive wounds on this individual. Seems unlikely to me. Also, the idea that there's multiple weapons used seems unlikely to occur in a battle scenario. And I've never been in battle, but it seems unlikely that someone would take the time to inflict, or multiple people would inflict in a battle scenario when there's lots of other chaos going on. So this is not my favorite. I have another one. This is the one that has, I think, become most popular recently with the new CT scans, and is my favorite currently. And this is the idea that there was some sort of battlefield or ritual execution of the king. And this accounts for the wounds to the face, especially the fact they were to the face only, suggesting maybe he was bound or incapable of defending himself, but also, again, to the face as representative of who he is, sort of as a ruler and as an individual. The use of multiple weapons, maybe not super common in executions as far as I'm aware, but does provide the opportunity for multiple sort of executors, especially if it's done in sort of a ritual or ceremonial fashion. Again, this could also account for the advanced decomposition before the individual was mummified. If he was far from home and needed to be transported home, or potentially his body wasn't released by his captors for a period of time, that could certainly account for why mummification had to be delayed. This also accounts for the hand deformities, even though I'm not super sold on those yet, because the authors suggest maybe his hands were bound for a period of time, and that's why, or he had some sort of seizure or something as a result of these injuries. I think that those are probably just because of the way that his body was placed after death. We know he was on his left side for a period of time. It's likely that he was not placed in a laid out, necessarily respectful position, and I think that the body just took on sort of that positioning. I don't think there's much significance to that. So execution is my preferred hypothesis for this scenario, but ultimately I think we can be pretty confident in saying that this is an example of homicide. There's really no way that this amount of injury would be inflicted by the person themselves or accidentally. So this is almost certainly a result of interpersonal violence by another individual, and it's very likely an example. And these injuries would have very likely been fatal. I didn't mention it earlier, but that one wound, especially to the upper forehead, is very, very close match to Hyksos battle axes. They've done research sort of looking at the measurements, and so that's a pretty safe bet that it was a Hyksos weapon that made that injury. Okay, case file number 3 is King Tut. I think I'm still doing okay on time here, you guys, so you guys may have heard of this one. King Tut, of course, was the final ruler of the 18th dynasty. He took over in a period of sort of religious turmoil in some sense, a return to traditional Egyptian religious values after a period of turmoil and animosity, I guess you could say. And ever since his sort of discovery in 1925, there were a lot of questions about how such a young man in the prime of his life, leader of a country, would have died. We think he took over around 9 years old and he died around 19. So that, coupled with the fact that we all know how famous this discovery was, I think prompted a lot of theory building and sort of conspiracies at the time that have really continued to today, because people are very excited by this case. It's very popular and people love those conspiracies and those really spectacular stories. The mummy of King Tut has been studied many times. It has been x-rayed several times. You can see up here. First study was done by, at the time of unwrapping, really, with Howard Carter, which we can talk about at some point. But the most recent, I guess, CT scans were in 2005 and revealed some very interesting new information that I think is relevant to circumstances around death. So this is one of the earliest images that we have of the remains of King Tutankhamun. You can see that the remains are actually in really bad shape. You can see that there's lots of cracking and sort of crumbling of the lower limbs. Who knows what's going on in the chest area, not very well defined. And just overall, just kind of looks kind of crumbly and not in great shape. And that is, it seems to be the case, that he's just not a very well-preserved mummy for a lot of reasons, which we'll talk about in a second. But the CT scan built this really beautiful 3D model of the king. And we'll sort of go through the body regions again. So the first thing they found was that the entire front of the chest cavity was missing. So the sternum, the ribs, the heart were all absent in the mummy as of the 2005 CT scan. And the ribs that are missing look to be cut from the body. They don't look perimortem, they do look postmortem because they're very sharp. There's no, as far as I know, there's no record of Howard Carter having done this, and we know the tomb was not looted. So some mystery about when this might have happened. But yeah, so we have this chest damage. We also have, this is the newest finding, not newest finding, a newer finding. And this is a complex fracture to the knee. This is the left knee on the inside. We call it the medial condyle of the femur. And you can see sort of the white areas that the arrow is pointing to are actually resin that have dripped into the wound, which indicates a few things. It happened before death, and that the wound was most likely an open wound so that the resin could get in. So if the fracture was that sort of serious that it perforated the soft tissue is essentially what is the most likely scenario here. Yeah, so we have this very sort of complex fracture of the knee. I will also point out, we think that King Tut was around 19 when he died, and these radiographs are actually really great examples to support that. If you look at the tibia and fibula, the lower legs, you can see a white line at the top of the tibia and of the fibula. That's called an epiphyseal line. That indicates that this individual was still somewhat growing. So his bones had not completely fused, essentially. So yeah, 19 is a pretty good estimate for this individual. What else do we have? Oh, we have a bone fragment found inside the cranium. And as of the CT scans, it was found here. We'll go into that more in a second, but put a pin in that one. And the newer research too also finds a lot of stuff going on in the feet of King Tut. So this was a nice sort of rendering on the outside of the 3D model, where the good stuff is visible is on sort of the bone imaging. And you can see the black arrow is actually pointing to a congenital anomaly, a congenitally missing phalanx. So each of your toes, other than your big toe, has 3 little bones in it. He's missing the middle bone. He just has the top. Not a big deal, happens all the time, but just of interest, interesting to note. And the yellow arrow is actually pointing at something much more interesting. And if you compare it sort of to that same bone on the other side, on the right side, there's a lot of sort of irregularity in that area. And that's actually the head of the second metatarsal. These are your metacarpals in your hand. So just imagine that in your foot. I'm not going to put my foot up here and show you where they are. So imagine that on your foot. And it's the head area. So it's what then articulates with like the little toes. We're seeing a lot sort of less radio density. So we're seeing lighter areas of less bone and sort of irregular outlines. The authors argue, and I agree, this is an example of some sort of necrosis, so dying tissue, usually a result of loss of blood flow to that area at some point. The authors suggest that this is an example of Kohler or Friedberg or Kohler syndrome, which are essentially just, as far as we know, idiopathic. We don't really know what causes them, but they happen in growing individuals where, because of something to do with growth and stress to that area, the blood supply is sort of limited to the part of the bone that's still growing. And so because of that, the bone starts to die. It can resolve itself. Today, most people are just sort of put in a cast or a boot or a brace and sort of left to get the pressure off of that bone while it heals and have no lasting problems. It's most common, my understanding is, in like high school age girls who play sports because it's usually a result of repeated stress to that area. As we've seen with you probably are all aware, there's a lot of indication that King Tut wasn't super active. We think there might have actually been some club foot deformity in this left foot where the foot was slightly rotated. That's really hard to tell exactly the degree of rotation just from the bone. So it's unlikely that he was playing soccer like high school girls that result in this injury. But it is possible that if he had some abnormal rotation, maybe that's putting different types of stress on that area and could be affecting the blood flow in that way. We don't know for sure, but it is a pretty clear example that there is some sort of, his foot would have been swollen likely and very uncomfortable to the touch, but not lethal at all. And these are the sort of dental x-rays. We have the arrow pointing to an impacted third molar. And this is also another good example to suggest that he's probably 18, 19. You can see that he has all of his other third molars. Did not translate well to the big screen. He has all of his other third molars, but they don't have completed apices. So their roots aren't complete all the way down yet. And so we see those in very late adolescence, which again is consistent with the age that we think that he is. They've done a bunch of other research that you can't see in a picture, but they've done some genetic testing and other things of King Tut's body as of recent years. And they found evidence of malaria, so genetic evidence of malaria, which is not the same thing as an active infection. You can have genetically malaria material in your body from a past infection. It doesn't mean it's active. There's currently no way to sort of really correlate finding the genetic material and an active infection, so we don't know if it was active. He also had mild scoliosis, very mild, would not have been very obvious at all. And he did have a cleft palate, but it did not permeate the soft tissue. So it was only an osseous, so it was only in the bone. So yes, things that were present, very unlikely to have contributed to his death. They also looked for another number of other diseases, infections, things like plague, tuberculosis, leishmaniasis, and those were all negative. So what are our hypotheses in this case? We always have to start with the assassination one, because I feel like that was the one that was so famous and popular from the very beginning. I think that had a lot to do with the circumstances surrounding the finding of the tomb and the sort of spectacularness of it. And people spoke about that bone fragments found in the cranium, and they pointed to that as a possible indication of assassination. Of course, knee fractures, any type of damage, and the damage to the chest. But what we found is those skulls, this is really interesting. It's all really interesting. This is really interesting. Those fragments that were found in the CT scan inside the cranium, the researchers went back and looked at the x-ray, of course, which I couldn't find, from the 1960s x-rays, and those fragments are in a different place. So that means that all that resin that is sitting in King Tut's skull, I guess I should have told you guys that, there's a bunch of resin in King Tut's skull, which is very anomalous in terms of, mummification practices of the time. But the bone fragments are not embedded in that. They're just loose, sort of in the cranium. And these researchers did a little bit more work, and they think that what's actually in the cranium is a part of the vertebra. So this is very likely to be post-mortem. Howard Carter had to do some interesting things to get King Tut out of that coffin and to get his mask off, including severing the head in the 1920s. So that is very likely to be related to that rather than anything perimortem. And then what I alluded to before, that chest damage that people have pointed to for a long time as being potentially related to damage or trauma in life is very likely to be postmortem. Some of the authors think that they actually found pieces of the ribs underneath the body, sort of in the coffin, but also those lines, they don't look perimortem, they look postmortem, they look like they're more chopped through. So this is not my favorite hypothesis. That's a very hard word to say. The other one that I think has received a lot of attention recently is the idea of a chariot crash. And again, people talk about those fragments in the cranium. They talk about the knee fracture and the chest damage. We've already talked about why a few of these can be sort of excluded. A knee fracture like this today is very frequently seen in adults in motor vehicle crashes when their knee impacts the dashboard. So similar to a chariot crash, but not quite. The other place that we see these types of fractures in people today are in high school athletes, specifically football players. So very different from necessarily a motor vehicle crash, but consistent with some sort of a fall. The reason I don't like this hypothesis is the lack of any sort of injuries to the rest of the body. If you fall from a chariot with enough force to break your knee, you would think you would put your hands out or something to sort of break your fall or stop your fall in some way. So this is not my favorite. Also, if we think back to his swollen foot, his potential club foot, to a certain extent, I wouldn't be riding a chariot if my foot hurt to just put weight on. That's just me. So I think it's potentially unlikely, but I think there's less solid evidence for this hypothesis. The other one that's receiving a lot of attention lately is the idea of a disease or infection or some sort of congenital anomaly. And they point to malaria. They point to the multiple congenital malformations and the impacted tooth in his young age. And all of these things are true. They just don't necessarily indicate a lethal condition. His multiple malformations were actually quite mild overall, noticeable potentially, but not lethal in any way. Certainly had evidence of a malarial infection. We have no way of knowing if it was active. Probably almost everyone in Egypt at this time had a malarial infection. Standing water, especially after the floods, was very common. That's where mosquitoes thrive. Most people probably have had a malarial infection. The impacted tooth, this could be a death sentence in the ancient world. If it got infected, they really had very little they could do about this. His looks okay so far, so we don't see any evidence of infection. And people really point to his young age as being evidence that he must have, maybe got caught plague. Plague apparently was going around in other parts of the Mediterranean at the time. So this has been a suggestion. But as I said, they searched for plague and tuberculosis and other things genetically and didn't find any of it. So I'm not going to rule this out as far as maybe a contributing factor, but I don't think it's the primary cause of death in this case. This is my new favorite-ish hypothesis, I think. And it's some sort of accidental, quote unquote, fall. I think this is most consistent with the type of knee fracture we see. As I said, this type of knee fracture is most common in football, high school football players. So people who are still growing and who are playing sort of contact sports. So they're hitting the ground, they're falling in weird sort of ways. That's what's causing these fractures. And I think an accidental fall is more likely if you have other sort of malformations going on, potentially club foot, swollen foot, injured foot, that kind of thing. I also think, though, that if you fall down hard enough that you essentially break your knee, but also potentially lacerate that area, so it's an open wound, that does leave you susceptible to other things, especially if you have potentially history of a malarial infection, especially if you potentially have other things going on. If your body is under stress because of blood loss, because of potentially a surface infection, it's very possible that other things sort of surface and become more dangerous at that time. It does not look like he survived very long after the knee injury. There's no signs of healing. So I think it's probably a complex sort of answer to that personally. And I just wanted to show you this. This is a knee fracture, and this is actually our modern day classification system for knee fractures. And it falls like pretty nicely into like C1-3 or C, what was the other one? C3-3, somewhere in there, depending on exactly where, because I can't see where all the fractures are from the images provided. But this is a well-known type of fracture, and it's most common in those football players, like I said. So I don't think that this is homicide. I don't think there's any evidence of that. I think it was most likely sort of an accidental or other cause. I do have one more case. I think I have time. Nobody's rushing to leave. Okay. So we'll talk about Ramses III. So Ramses III, of course, was sort of the last warrior king of the 20th dynasty. His reign was really marked by a lot of warlike activities, a lot of sort of turmoil at home because of those constant threats of invasion, and a lot of economic problems. And again, because of this, I think it led a lot of people to assume very early on that potentially, something else, mayhem was at play or something. And so his remains were discovered in 1886 and x-rays were taken, but the most recent evidence that we'll use today are those CT scans from 2005. And I show this picture to show that Ramses III's mummy is a really great example of really fantastic mummification from this period. Just very well preserved, very well done, and a lot of really interesting information. This is one of the earlier images that we have, and then we'll go through all of our evidence again. You can see there's no brain present, so traditional mummification. We can actually see that there's damage to the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, so it's sort of this area here, suggesting that there was sort of intranasal removal of that brain. And the only thing to point out here that some people have noticed is that his nose is quite flattened. There's no real osseous skeletal effects associated with that. It just looks probably from the bandages while they were bandaging him while he was being desiccated, sort of just shaped the nose in that way. Other than that, nothing of significance really in this image. One thing that has always been very interesting about Ramses III, I'm sure you've all heard maybe of the harem conspiracy. And this was very early on, kind of discounted by researchers because they said there's not a mark on this guy. There's no way that he died as a result of this harem conspiracy. Don't worry, for those of you who haven't heard of it, I'll tell you all about it in a second. But maybe not. So one of the things to note here that becomes very interesting during the CT scan is the bandages around the neck. And there's a lot of them, and you might wonder why. Or someone might wonder why. Apparently nobody wondered why for a while, but somebody finally wondered why during the CT scanning. And this is what's under the bandages. So that arrow is pointing to, remember the CT scan takes slices. So sometimes what you're seeing as like a piece of something is whole. It's just the way that the CT scan works. So this is actually a piece of a Eye of Horus amulet that's been placed within the neck. And it's been placed there. These images are really hard to see, and I'm sorry, you guys. It's been placed there because there's actually a cut wound to the neck. And it sort of travels from the 5th to the 7th vertebrae of the neck and severs all of those soft tissues leading up to the vertebra. So those stars show sort of some of the perforation of that nice black area, that black line that is the soft tissue. And that gray stuff is the resin that has poured into that open wound to basically infiltrate it, which suggests again that it happened before the resin was applied. We have a slightly different, better image here. Those stars again are showing where the cut marks is, and that very white area right below them is an amulet that was placed inside that wound. And then you see again that the sort of gray resin that's below and above on top of the skin actually reaches all the way to the bone in that area, and that's because that wound was open at the time. There's a few other things that are very interesting here. This is not necessarily of significance in terms of our questions today, but I thought it was a really cool image, so I had to include it. This is an image from the CT scan actually showing amulets inside the thorax of this individual. So you can see a little Horus figurine if you look really closely, Osiris figurine right on top there. And these are all amulets that are placed inside the body cavity, which I just thought was so, can you imagine taking a CT image and just like pulling up on the screen and seeing that? Seems very interesting, very, very cool. And so we see a few other things. That top arrow, again, is pointing to the amulet in the neck, but these other two arrows are actually pointing to what we would call ossification. So the bone between the vertebra has bridged between, I think, the 8th and the 11th thoracic vertebra. And it's sort of, your vertebra are like little pies that sit on top of each other. These ones are all fused together down the front. And so they fuse their anterior ligament. And this is a very classic example of a condition called DISH, which I can't currently remember. Diffuse idiopathic something hyperostosis. It's essentially just this fusion of this anterior ligament up along your spine, and it gets worse as you get older and can fuse more and more. Again, not lethal, not really impacting necessary mortality, but it could impact sort of flexibility and morbidity, and would again have gotten worse as you got older. But just a very interesting thing to see so well displayed in that. And then the last sort of area of the body that we'll look at is the feet. And you can see here, the first sort of unique thing is the feet are wrapped separately, and there's no sort of overall wrapping. And that's because, if you look closely, the big toe has been severed on the right side. So you can see the very nice white bone, and then this sort of dark, like more see-through material. Not only was the bone severed, but the embalmers replaced it with linen so that when they wrapped it up, it would still look just like an intact big toe. And this is a very good example of perimortem. The angle there is very classically perimortem, and the margins are very clean. So very, very likely to be perimortem trauma, which suggests that we have not only the cut mark to the throat, but also to a toe. So there's at least 2 instances of trauma in this case. So we'll look at those hypotheses. And I think there's really only one when you talk about a deep slash to the neck, but we'll go through the evidence anyway. I think this is a pretty good example of a homicide and does potentially fall very nicely within this idea of assassination as part of the harem conspiracy. We have the angle of the injury, sort of this up to down sort of direction from the 5th to the 7th vertebra. Very unlikely to be self-inflicted in that area. Also very unlikely to have those multiple injuries and have them be self-inflicted, one to the toe, one to the throat. Not something we usually see. Very unlikely to be accidental. I can't think of a situation in which that would accidentally happen. And again, would be lethal. So these are the things that we think about, again, when we're trying to determine, is this potentially homicide? And again, the use of sharp force. That is also very indicative of a potential interpersonal homicide event. And for those who don't know, the harem conspiracy is an event that happened during Ramses III's reign that we have textual evidence of from the judicial papyrus that's located at the Turin Museum. And for a long time, researchers read this and they were like, oh, there was an assassination attempt on Ramses III. It was instigated by one of his secondary wives to put her son, on the throne. And something like, 30 to 40 people were implicated in this plot, ranging from women within the harem to government officials to everyone you can think of, to essentially overthrow the Ramesside family. And the way that it's written, though, leaves some question about whether Ramses III survived. And so for a long time, there was a lot of debate, and most people came down to the assumption that, no, he must have survived. Like, right? He's the one that wrote the papyrus. It seems very likely that his son now wrote that, but wrote it in the voice of Ramses III. And of course, you would never say that the king is dead in writing, of course, because of all the power that writing holds in ancient Egypt. You would never say, oh, the king has died. You would never say that. So it's not unsurprising. It's not surprising that they didn't come out and say that the king had been killed in this plot. But this fits very nicely with that having happened. I think that 30 people were put to death for this conspiracy, and including the son that was supposed to come to power, and that Ramses IV very successfully quashed that little attempted rebellion or coup. But yeah, so before I let you go, I'm going to ask you questions again because we had our baseline. Now we have to see how we did. So same rules, thumbs up if it's yes, thumbs down if it's no, and somewhere in between if you're not sure. So can a forensic anthropologist study ancient remains? Yes, we can. We certainly can. They aren't technically considered forensics once we do that. We're sort of using our skills in a different context. Again, nobody's being tried for these murders. Nobody's going to be, no death certificate is going to be written. So it's not technically forensic anthropology, but we can certainly lend our expertise. Can we determine timing of injury as forensic anthropologists? We can to a certain extent. Yeah, absolutely. We can say before death, around death, after death. We cannot necessarily say what happened at the moment of death, but we can use our contextual information to get us close. And last question, can forensic anthropologists determine the cause of death? I see thumbs down. Yeah, if I had to make that clear. There are certain limitations to what we can do. There's lots of ways that people can hurt themselves and die that don't affect their bones. And so we have to be really careful with the way we sort of report our findings. And so this is just a selection of the references I use, the ones that I found most important. But if you want the rest of my references, just let me know. And that's me. If you ever want to learn more, you can go to my website. And I believe I can take questions. Go ahead.
A couple of months ago, we had Ben Hare give his talk about the hippopotamus in King Tut. It seems to all come down to not just the fact that those cuts on the bone were post-mortem, but were they post-mortem 3,000 years ago or post-mortem 60 years ago?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. It's so hard to tell. And who knows, there could have been damage to those bones, and that's why they were cut out. Seems unlikely. Again, the tomb was not looted, so it would have had to happen during the mummification process or during the time after it was discovered. So we sort of have, in my estimation, if they had removed the front of the chest cavity because of damage, they would have replaced it with something. Not to say that that couldn't have been removed later by Howard Carter or something, but I am more inclined to think that it's a more recent versus a more ancient removal, just because we don't have anything that replaced it, and we know how important it was to have a whole body going into the afterlife. But that's just my 2 cents. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you determine the ages of the first 2 cases, examining the remains?
I probably could have. I didn't. So the best parts of the skeleton to look at for older, anybody over the age of 25, let's say, is the front of the pelvis where the 2 halves of the pelvis meet. That's the best part. It's really hard to get a look at from CT scans. So you really do have to have the original CT scans to be able to do that. The researchers there's a really great book called Scanning the Pharaohs. I'm sure maybe some of you know it. And they did go through and do age estimation on a lot of these guys. They didn't use the pubic symphysis, that one that I told you about. I would love to get my hands on these scans to be able to examine that for myself, because a lot of the age estimations on these individuals are based on things that we don't use too much in forensic anthropology anymore. Things like cranial suture closure. We don't use that anymore because we know that there's just too much sort of wiggle room. Things sometimes like dental wear, if you don't have a good reference sample for that, it's not always the most useful. So I would love to get my hands on the scans to be able to look and do my own age estimation on those, but I didn't. But they are definitely older adults. They are not growing anymore. You don't see any of those epiphyseal lines like you did in King Tut. Yes.
How do you handle the controversy? Because as a scientist, you have reasons why you believe what you believe. And yet a lot of Egyptologists and historians would argue with you and say, that can't possibly be true. They have their own ideas.
Sure.
Do you have the same problem with medical examiners and things that, you can say for sure something is the way I see it, and they say, no, that can't be?
I haven't had that problem. Mostly in my experience, medical examiners will ask for more information. If they don't buy your conclusion or they don't think it fits in, they're going to ask you to go back and find, more supporting evidence, or they'll ask you to find more sources or something. Very rarely will they say, nope, that doesn't fit within my, what I've decided. They're usually going to present it as, come back with more evidence.
Why do you suppose an Egyptologists are so set in their ways?
I think it's because there's so many different types of evidence when it comes to the study of ancient cultures, especially one that's as well documented in textual sources as ancient Egypt, because you can have two completely different sort of pieces of evidence that say completely different things. And neither one of them is infallible. Even, skeletal analyses, even if we have a pretty good idea of what happened, it's not infallible. And neither is the textual sources. We know that there's a lot of bias that goes into that. So I think the sort of controversies are well warranted when we have such complex sort of potentially disagreeing evidence.
So you have an opinion on DNA as evidence?
In what circumstance?
There's a lot of questions as to whether ancient DNA is all that accurate.
I think it can be very accurate if it is extracted and quantified under very controlled and careful situations, and if it is adequately peer reviewed, if somebody else is given the chance to do the same thing and comes back with the same results. But it is very difficult to do. And I don't understand all the intricacies of it. And I do think that a lot of it comes down to those controlled extraction and quantification techniques. Absolutely. Anyone online have a question?
The only question I saw said, why are some images of Tut with a sunken chest abdomen? Does he have some illness? And I said, you mentioned that the heart had been removed post-mortem, but we're not sure exactly when and why.
Yeah. So it's essentially the fact that the front of the chest cavity has been removed. The sort of lower abdomen is always going to be kind of sunken in. You just don't have a lot of bones there. So that tends to get sunken in. But I didn't mention this, and I meant to, I'm sure many of you know this, but the embalming practices of King Tut were very unique, very interesting. They used so much resin in the process of mummifying King Tut that it presented a lot of problems for Howard Carter. As I mentioned, they had to do some questionable things to get King Tut out of the coffin, and has sort of continued to sort of pose problems for moving the remains and getting them out of their coffin. The amount of resin we see in the cranium, very unusual. It was actually poured in twice. Researchers suggest they can actually see two separate sort of layers of slightly different densities. Salima Ikram had a great hypothesis for why this might be. She was suggesting that maybe they were really trying to reinforce the connotation with Osiris, with the sort of darkening of the skin and the sort of blackening with the resin to really reinforce the return to traditional Egyptian religious values, which I thought was a very interesting argument because it was so much resin. Howard Carter actually left King Tut out in the sun for several hours to see if it would melt the resin so they could get the body out. No such luck. So a lot of problems.
Highlighted the amulet and Shapti being inserted into Ramesses' body.
Oh.
Was that unusual, and what is the significance?
So it wasn't unusual to have amulets sort of in the body or even in wrappings or things like that. The fact that it was in the wound was quite unusual. My understanding is that the authors who wrote the fabulous piece about it, suggests that it has to do with healing. So attempting to really reconstruct the body for the afterlife. We all know that's very important to the ancient Egyptians to have a complete body going into the afterlife. So with the toe, they could sort of replace it with that linen, but they did in fact put some amulets in that area as well that I just didn't have time to show. So the amulet was really an attempt to heal that wound so the king could go into the afterlife intact. Okay, thank you. Bye everyone. For real this time.